Our speaker today is Britton Stephens. Britt graduated from Harvard, magna cum laude, and then after that that was his bachelor's degree, sorry. Then following a 2-year stint with the U.S. Geological Survey, he went to graduate school at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, where after he received his doctorate, he moved about as far from the ocean as possible and came to CERES, Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, here in Boulder, of course. And after 2 years, he joined NCAR in 2002. Since then, he's been very active. His research focuses on carbon dioxide and oxygen measurements in the atmosphere. He has developed, for instance, the Medusa gas sampler that's flown on a number of aircraft, and a vacuum UV oxygen analyzer for both airborne, shipborne, and ground operation. He's been the co-PI of the HIPER Pole-to-Pole Observations of greenhouse gases, known more commonly as HIPPO, which we'll be discussing here. And also he is a co-PI on the upcoming ORCAS project, which is the, oxygen-nitrogen ratios and carbon dioxide in
Southern Ocean.
Something in the Southern Ocean. I forgot what the airborne measurement in the Southern Ocean.
There you go.
So we welcome Britt.
Thanks, Stuart. Everyone can hear me okay? So I'm going to be presenting results from 3 different measurement efforts. One, as Stuart mentioned, is the HIPPO project, which ran on the NSF NCAR G5 aircraft. The other is some more recent observations made on the NSF ship Laurence M. Gould, which is shown pictured here. And the third is a long-running network of station measurements run by the Scripps Oxygen Program. And for example, here's the Mauna Loa Observatory, which is one of the sites in the network. The ship is currently parked at Palmer Station, which is another site, and the plane is sitting on the runway in American Samoa, which is another site in the network. So a lot of people have contributed to these measurements, in particular Jonathan Bent, who recently got his PhD from Scripps, Andy Watt, who's in the audience here, and Steve Schertz. Contributed to the HIPPO program and as well the Gould project. On the modeling side, I'll be showing some results from Laura Splendy, who's a postdoc out at Scripps. Sarah Mikloff-Fletcher and Prabir Patra have both run atmospheric transport models using a host of lower boundary conditions provided by various ocean modeling groups and ocean modelers in particular who are listed here. So thanks to all of my colleagues. So we measure atmospheric oxygen because of its tight linkages to CO2. And so we can try and understand more about what's influencing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by measuring both CO2 and oxygen. That's depicted in the cartoon here, showing that for terrestrial photosynthesis and respiration, you have almost -1-to-1 exchange of CO2 and oxygen. Fossil fuel burning produces CO2 and consumes oxygen, but it consumes almost 1.4 moles of oxygen for every mole of CO2 because the carbon is in a more reduced state. And then in the ocean, biological productivity, of course, influences oxygen and CO2, but also warming and cooling of the surface ocean drives fluxes in and out. And those fluxes, because of the different buffering chemistry for CO2 and the different solubilities, is largely decoupled. So these two processes are tightly coupled, whereas the ocean, it's doing different things for O2 and CO2. So the brief outline of my talk is just some sort of ancient history. There'll be some black and white figures and some highly pixelated cartoons from the circa late 90s. And then a discussion of the HIPPO airborne project, the Gould measurements, and the outline will also sort of loosely follow what are the main features of interest in atmospheric oxygen. So those are what's referred to as the equatorial bulge that has some bearing on where heat is penetrating the ocean and where deep waters are upwelling. The interhemispheric difference in oxygen, which relates to the meridional transport of heat and carbon. Seasonal cycles, which can be used to constrain hemispheric scale marine productivity. And then also some specific things going on in the Southern Ocean. So the Scripps Oxygen Program has been run by Ralph Keeling now for almost 25 years. And this figure is showing in blue measurements made at 2 different stations, Alert and Cape Grim. And this is from the IPCC AR5. And the first sort of primary application of oxygen measurements was partitioning the global CO2 sink. So you can take this cartoon I just showed and make an assumption that the long-term balance of oxygen with the ocean is, the long-term flux of oxygen with the ocean is 0. Because putting CO2 in the atmosphere doesn't have any, has a big effect on the ocean air CO2 flux, but essentially no effect on the ocean air oxygen flux. And when you do that, you end up with a couple algebraic equations where the trend in CO2 is the result of fossil fuel burning, terrestrial biospheric exchange, and ocean exchange. But the long-term trend in oxygen is just the fossil fuel burning multiplied by a known ratio and the terrestrial biosphere by a known ratio. So 2 equations, 2 unknowns, you can solve it. And the result is that over the past decade, something like 2.7 billion tons of carbon per year are going into the ocean. And you can see that graphically here because the scales are the same and the green curves are CO2. So what you notice is that oxygen is going down faster than CO2 is going up. The other way to say that is CO2 is not going up as fast as oxygen is going down, and that's because CO2 is being absorbed by the oceans. So this is an important thing that we can do with oxygen. There's still some big uncertainties on this number, but it turns out they're not coming from the oxygen measurements. They're coming from our estimates of fossil fuel burning, which have inherent uncertainties in them. And then I should point out that you almost never see oxygen in the atmosphere expressed in ppm. This is the only time I've ever really seen it. And this is because this figure was dumbed down for the IPCC audience. The problem is that the changes are very small. So what you see here is over 25 years, about a 100 ppm drop in oxygen. Well, there are 210,000 ppms of oxygen in the atmosphere. So this is 1 part out of 2,000, or 0.05%. Not 5%, but 0.05% change in oxygen over 25 years. That change is so small that changes in other gases actually have an impact on the ppm of oxygen. So if oxygen hadn't changed at all, but you'd had this much CO2 added to the atmosphere, the parts per million of oxygen would have decreased simply because there's more CO2 there. So, and that would have actually made this curve go down by another about 20 ppm. So this curve has been corrected for the diluting effect of CO2, but normally we don't use those units. We use something which I'm showing down in the lower left here, which is a relative unit, oxygen-nitrogen ratio. So by ratioing to nitrogen, you remove the influence of diluting effects of CO2 and water. And you can express very small changes by subtracting the ratio of dividing the ratio of a sample by the ratio of a reference, subtracting 1 and multiplying by 1,000,000. So this is analogous to what you might have heard that's used frequently in isotope notation, per mil. So a per meg is a 1,000th of a per mil. Of course, combines the Latin and the Greek, which you don't see very often, but it's the unit we use. So that's something to keep in mind. The rest of this talk will be in units of per meg. So there are a lot of challenges in making measurements at this degree of precision. Fractionation is a big one. There are a lot of different ways to get oxygen and nitrogen to separate along temperature gradients or pressure gradients through diffusion. If you have say you're pulling air down from a tower at a really high flow rate and you want to pick off a small flow to go into your instrument, you'll get more nitrogen going one way and more oxygen going the other way. And if you walk up and put your hand on the T in your plumbing, you'll see the amount of oxygen and nitrogen change just because you're warming up that point in the plumbing. Permeation through elastomers, O-rings, pump diaphragms and things, plastic tubing can be a problem. Surface effects, if you're changing the humidity or the pressure in a tubing line, you can be kicking oxygen and nitrogen off the walls. I mentioned the dilution problems. And then finally, everything in this business is relative. We don't have an absolute measurement of oxygen at these concentrations. We only know oxygen out to about 4 decimal places, and we're doing measurements out at about 6. So everything's relative to a suite of cylinders maintained at Scripps. And then we do this big pyramid scheme to get numbers on our field measurements. This is the lab calibration system that's over in the next building. Some of you saw it during the lab tour a few weeks ago, but there's a large cylinder to keep a large box to keep the cylinders insulated to minimize temperature effects. This is a chiller for removing all the water. And so then once you have these cylinders, you have to worry about how stable is the oxygen concentration in that cylinder and how do you get the air out without affecting it. So nonetheless, we persist against these challenges, and I just wanted to highlight this cartoon one more time and show that, besides this sort of big application of separating out the CO2 sinks, there are a lot of other things you can do with oxygen. And one thing that I'm going to be talking about for most of this talk is trying to infer what's going on with the ocean biogeochemistry. And so, to do that, we need to sort of come up with a way to cancel out or ignore what's happening on land. And the trick is to add oxygen and CO2 together and define a tracer called atmospheric potential oxygen. So photosynthesis and respiration on land don't have any effect on the total oxygen in the atmosphere. There's a small sink in fossil fuel burning because, as I mentioned, you're consuming a little bit more oxygen than you are producing CO2. There's a ratio in the definition here that accounts for the fact that photosynthesis and respiration on land incorporate other things like nitrogen, and so the ratio is not exactly 1. The calculations are not particularly sensitive to what that value is. You'll see 1.05 used sometimes. But the net result is that you have this tracer, APO, which is primarily sensitive to ocean oxygen and CO2 exchange. On a seasonal basis, because the CO2 exchange with the ocean is highly damped by the buffering chemistry, it's essentially a tracer for ocean oxygen fluxes. On latitudinal gradients and long-term trends, it's sensitive to ocean and CO2. So APO was first defined in this paper that I wrote when I was a grad student back at Scripps, and it was using the measurements from the Scripps network shown here. There were 9 stations in a rough line down the middle of the Pacific. The plot on the right is showing the interhemispheric gradient from north to south for APO in per meg. And the measurements define this decreasing to the north trend. And I'm showing on there the results of 3 different ocean biogeochemistry models whose fluxes were run through an atmospheric transport model. So these are predictions from 3 different models of what that gradient should be, and then measurements of what it actually is. And the big thing that jumps out at you is this large bulge predicted by the models. And unfortunately, at least at that time, we didn't have good measurements in the equatorial region to constrain that. And then also that the observations define this gradient, whereas the models seem to have about the same. So there's the bulge there is something like 10 per meg. And then the models are describing essentially no interhemispheric difference in APO. So at the time, we speculated that these models might have too much heat diffusing in at low latitudes, resulting in too much water coming up at the equator and not enough in the Southern Ocean. At about the same time, Nani Duskin at GFDL published a series of papers sort of explaining how the overturning circulation of the ocean and actually the density structure of the ocean can be explained by the difference in the amount of diffusivity or diffusion of heat getting in at low latitudes and the diffusion along isopycnals at high latitudes. So the idea is that if the models are for numeric reasons, it's very hard to get the vertical diffusion in an ocean model down small as it probably is in the real world. So for numerical reasons, you might have too much heat coming into the ocean here, warming up the water and causing it to rise. That was the idea at the time. The concept that APO and heat would be closely linked is because after canceling out the effects of biology, you're essentially left with the thermal forcing of the ocean. And there's actually a tracer you can define on the ocean side called ocean potential oxygen, which is very similar. It's defined here with this stands for dissolved inorganic carbon term that compensates for effects of biology in the ocean. You have to do a correction because forming of calcium carbonate shells affects DIC through alkalinity. But the key thing is that using oceanographic measurements, you can calculate a tracer whose variation is entirely due to air-sea exchange of potential oxygen. So you have atmospheric potential oxygen above, ocean potential oxygen below, and the fluxes are linked through the air-sea fluxes of O2 and CO2. You might wonder why, or you might have wondered why we called it atmospheric potential oxygen and not potential atmospheric oxygen. And now you can actually see that even 15 years ago, it was anticipated that this tracer may want to be defined, and we didn't want to have to call it potential oceanic oxygen. So it turns out that heat fluxes in the ocean are very hard to measure and estimate. This is seminal paper from Genesho and Wunsch, 2003. The symbols with the whiskers are hydrographic estimates from hydrographic sections, sort of estimating the actual movement of the water and the heat content it's carrying, whereas there are various other estimates from some top-down constraints there. What you see, this is northward heat transport. There's poleward heat transport in both hemispheres, but there's more poleward heat transport in the northern hemisphere, and that's because of this overturning circulation in the Atlantic that's bringing mostly surface waters to the north. But there are huge uncertainties on that. So the idea is that if we have this really tight relationship shown here between OPO and potential temperature, theta, in the ocean, that we can use measurements of atmospheric potential oxygen to constrain ocean heat transports. So what this is showing is probably millions of measurements from the GLODAP program of oxygen and temperature in the ocean. And what it's essentially telling you is that where waters are warm, where they're taking up heat from the atmosphere, they're releasing oxygen and CO2 because of the decrease in solubility when you warm the water. And so they have lower OPO. And conversely, where it's cool, where the oceans are taking up heat from, or sorry, are giving off heat to the atmosphere, they're also cooling and their solubility increases, so they take up oxygen and CO2. So, whoops, I've gone too far. So there was a whole series of papers looking at the interhemispheric gradient and APO and trying to figure out what it can tell us about the ocean or what its limitations are. Probably the biggest challenge to using APO to learn about the ocean comes from uncertainties in atmospheric transport. So this is a paper by Tobias Nagler where he used 11 ocean models, these are the colored lines, and 2 atmospheric transport models. So the top panel is from a model called TM2, and the bottom panel, a newer version of the same model called TM3. So what you'd like to be able to do, and the observations are the same in both plots of APO again, you'd like to be able to use the observations to say which of these models, which of these colored lines is more realistic. But the problem is that if you notice, the difference between the range of all the colored lines is of the same magnitude as the difference between using this transport model and using that transport model, both for the equatorial bulge and for what's going on in the Southern Ocean. So for example, this model shown in red here has got about a 10 per meg difference depending on which atmospheric transport model you use. And that's because one of these models is trapping air near the surface, so fluxes from the ocean have a much bigger impact on concentrations than the atmosphere, whereas another is ventilating that signal more deeply in the atmosphere, and the same flux will have a smaller impact on concentrations at the surface. So again, the black points here are all observing stations at the surface of the Earth. I should point out that this paper included measurements from the Princeton oxygen network, which included some shipboard measurements in the equatorial region. So there's sort of a first look at what that equatorial bulge might be. So, what to do when stuck with this problem of surface measurements and uncertain atmospheric transport is you get yourself a Gulfstream V and you go fly around. And by profiling up and down in the atmosphere, you can measure the air down low and the air up high, and you can be less sensitive to the vertical distribution of signals because you're measuring both low and high. So we went out with the G5 5 times in 3 years in the HIPPO project. Each of those 5 times we flew something like this, leaving from Boulder, going to Anchorage, and then to the North Pole and back, down across the Pacific to Christchurch, to about 67 south and back, and then returning. The whole time the plane was profiling up and down from very near the surface to either 9 kilometers or as high as 14 kilometers. And the times of year we went were spaced across the seasonal cycle. So this plot is showing the seasonal cycle in oxygen at Palmer Station, Antarctica, and the symbols are just circling that line when we flew. So we flew in January of 2009, November of 2009, March and April of 2010, and then June and August of 2011. And I should point out that there was a huge group of people doing measurements on the plane, measured over 92 different atmospheric species. And there's some web pages here and lots of other resources. The data is all publicly available, and we encourage people to use it. So the instruments that I was responsible for, along with a bunch of other people already mentioned, are the NCAR airborne oxygen instrument and the NCAR Scripps Medusa flask sampler. I won't say too much about them. This is the guts of the airborne oxygen instrument is a vacuum ultraviolet source, a xenon lamp that's absorbed by oxygen. The instrument calibrates every 2.5 seconds, and it gets a measurement with a precision of just a couple per meg. The flask sampler has 32 of these 1.5 liter glass flasks stored in 2 boxes, and it fills those at various times in the flight. They go back to Scripps and get measured for oxygen, argon, CO2, and then isotopes of CO2. So this is what we found when we went out in January of 2009. What I'm showing here is pressure on the y-axis, an analog for altitude, and latitude on the x-axis, north on the right. The trace of the plane is in gray. The symbols are the flask measurements, and all of the data have been interpolated within the flight envelope. So as we went south, oxygen started to increase. And when we got to the Southern Ocean, we ran into this massive plume of oxygen. And when I was on the airplane, I was asking people if they felt better down low, if they were noticing that they were breathing all this extra oxygen. I tried to convince them that they should, but if you look at this, it's about a 20 per meg increase in oxygen. So what that means is that for every 1,000,000 molecules of air, there were about 4 extra molecules of oxygen. So, but it turns out the precision of the instrument is about 10 times finer than that, so we were able to resolve it. When we went back out, this is now the HIPPO 5 campaign in August of 2011. We saw the opposite, so low oxygen. Sorry, I should just go back a step and say that the reason this plume is here is because over the Southern Ocean in summer, there's a lot of biological productivity, which is producing oxygen, and you're warming the surface waters, driving oxygen out. So, so then when we went back, we saw the opposite, sort of a plume of negative or low oxygen over the Southern Ocean. And that's the result of deep mixing of water in winter. So you're bringing up water from below that has accumulated this organic matter over the summer that's been respiring and consuming oxygen. So you have really low oxygen in the deep water. Both the previous plot and this plot are shown after subtracting a reference value defined by the long-term trend at Mauna Loa. So they're all sort of 0 plus and minus a little bit to make it easier to see the seasonal variability. So we collected 9 slices like this over the 5 campaigns. And these are shown here. This is HIPPO 1 I showed before. We went back to the Arctic on all of the campaigns except for HIPPO 1, and that's how you end up with 9 slices from 5 campaigns. So, and I'm showing HIPPO 2 at the end because it was in October, November. So these are sort of shown left to right in seasonal progression. So after we were there in January, you can see the plume over the Southern Ocean sort of dissipate while the deficit in the north grows. In sort of early summer, the hemispheres are fairly balanced, although you see these sort of high anomalies in oxygen, which are related to blooms in the ocean. So this is summertime in the North Pacific, and we're dipping down. We thought it was the problem with the instrument the first few times it happened, but you got in the boundary layer and oxygen shot way up. And it's related to actual emission from these really strong blooms. And then as you get into Southern Hemisphere winter, you start to see this drawdown. This was the figure I showed previously, which then dissipates. You never see the high or the bright red colors in the north or these dark black colors in the south, and that's because there's a north-south gradient that I mentioned. So I'm using the same color scale for all the plots, and so it looks like the peak in the summer of the Southern Hemisphere is the extreme of one on one bar and vice versa. So now what you can do with those 9 slices I just showed you is average them all up to get annual means. I didn't do it quite that simply. What I did was I binned the data by 10-degree latitude and 100 millibar bins, and then I fit a single harmonic, so a cosine and a sine, to all the data in each bin, and then and an offset term, which is the annual mean. So this is what you get, a slice for the annual mean oxygen concentration in the atmosphere. And again, you see lower oxygen in the north. The sort of equatorial bulge, but it's not really centered on the equator. It's actually shifted south of the ITCZ. And it appears to be propagating all the way through the troposphere. So what I'm going to do is now take this data and calculate column averages. So I picked 300 millibars because that's approximately the height of the tropopause. And we didn't really fly consistently enough above that to get good signals. So on the next plot, I'm going to show this data just averaged up by column. And then I'm also going to show the surface measurements below an altitude of 900 millibars. So okay, so the blue is the column and the red is the surface. Again, you can see this bulge in the sort of equatorial region. The surface and the column are very close to one another, and that's probably related to the vigorous convection you get in the tropics, sort of mixing everything up. But in the mid-latitudes, you see they diverge with the surface being lower than the column, so that's indicative of uptake of oxygen, which is, as the waters move polewards, they are, let me see, so the surface is lower in oxygen, indicating uptake as the waters are moving northward and cooling off, or so they're moving poleward and cooling off. I didn't want to say that backwards. Okay, so this is that same blue curve, along with some model estimates of what the transect should be. And you can see they sort of capture the position and the magnitude of the bulge. I should say what they are. So it's two different models from what used to be CCSM and is now CESM. So CCSM3, CESM1, MOM4 from GFDL, and then a collection of data-based flux estimates. GK stands for Garcia and Keeling 01, where they took measurements of dissolved oxygen in the surface oceans and came up with a flux climatology. That's also combined with the Takahashi PCO2 flux climatology. So the two green curves here run through two different atmospheric transport models, TM3 run by Sarah Mikolov-Fletcher and ACTM run by Prabir Patra, whereas all of the others are run through TM3. So one thing you notice first is that the two models here that are run through different atmospheric transport models but have mostly the same fluxes are fairly close to one another. So we don't think that atmospheric transport uncertainty is playing a big role in explaining these curves. So because we're averaging over the column again, we've sort of taken out the biggest source of uncertainty in transport, which is how far these signals are propagating vertically. They don't agree perfectly because they're actually using different fossil fuel flux estimates. So the light green is slightly higher in the south and slightly lower in the north. Then in terms of the other models, the CCSM3 is sort of the previous version of the global ocean biogeochemistry model, has sort of the weakest north-south gradient of all of the models, whereas CESM, shown in red here, has the strongest. As I mentioned, everything's all relative. When you start running a model, it's all relative too. So everything's been adjusted to sort of agree at Mauna Loa. So you can sort of shift the model curves visually by eye if you want to make them match up better. But the models have come a long way since that 1998 paper that I showed at the start, and you don't see any of them predicting these massive bulges in the equatorial region. So what we're observing is about a 5 per meg increase south of the equator, and then a north-south gradient if you average sort of between 0 and 60 south in both hemispheres of -8 per meg. So Laura Resplendi, who's a postdoc at Scripps, has done a lot of work investigating this north-south gradient. And she's taken a series of ocean models that were run by the group at GFDL with various perturbations to the diapycnal mixing at low latitudes and the isopycnal mixing at high latitudes to sort of span a full range of where the heat penetrates and where the deep water comes up. And these are all indicated by the 5 different MOM acronyms here. I can't, to be honest, remember what, I think HH is high, high, LL is low, low. But these models have been around for a long time, a number of papers written on them. Laura used them because somebody has developed a system for inverting these models, so she can take the oxygen measurements from all of the oceanographic measurements over the past several decades and use the model to infer what the fluxes must have been. So that's what are shown by these. The first 5 points here are ocean inversions using different versions of ocean transport fields. The other 2 are both from the ECHO-1 consortium, the MIT GCM. And so what she found is that the relationship between the north-south APO gradient in the troposphere and the meridional heat transport in petawatts is very tightly, the relationship is very tight. One of the perturbed MOM models is off this line, but the MIT models and the others all fall on a really tight line. And if you just use that Ganeshaw and Wunsch estimate for the north-south heat transport, you wouldn't really be able to say, that the models were right or wrong. I mean, you could probably reject this one, but the others are all within the large uncertainty. But if you use the fact that APO and heat are related, and you use this HIPPO constraint, you get a much tighter error bars, and you get the suggestion that the northward heat transport in the world oceans is something between something like 0.6 and 1 petawatt. And notably that all of these models are underestimating that transport. The project that Laura is working on is funded by NOAA to support the carbon tracker project. And the idea is to get better prior estimates of the carbon flux in the ocean. So if your model is underestimating the northward transport of heat and the southward transport of oxygen, it's probably also underestimating the southward transport of CO2. So ultimately, that's what this project was sort of designed for, but we're able to learn a lot about ocean heat transport at the same time. So let me see. Moving on to the seasonal cycle and going back in time again, I don't expect you to stare at these much, but just to show that the seasonal cycle in APO has been used for a number of different things. On the left is a comparison to a particular ocean model, which for 9 different stations in the Scripps network appeared to do a pretty good job. And on the right is a comparison to a bunch of different ocean fluxes calculated with different representations of air-sea gas exchange, so using dissolved oxygen measurements. And these are both great things that we'd like to be able to do, but again, because of the uncertainty in atmospheric transport, you really don't know what the true answer is. So this is a result of Tegan Blaine's graduate work, where she took she participated in the Transcom project, where other modelers provided 9 atmospheric transport models that were all running the same ocean fluxes. So these are plots of the seasonal amplitude in APO from those 9 different atmospheric transport models. And you can see they're very different. So all forced with the same fluxes, one of them gets about 60 or 70 APO seasonal amplitude in the mid-latitudes, and another one gets 100. So if you're looking at a surface station and trying to evaluate whether a model is getting the seasonal cycle and APO right, you have sort of a factor of 2 uncertainty in what the surface APO cycle should be. So here it is for HIPPO. The same gridding I did before with the fitting of 1 harmonic. This is now, instead of the annual mean offset term, is the seasonal amplitude. I mean, the things that jump out at you, of course, is that it goes to almost 0 right at the equator. It's high in both high latitudes and higher at the surface. And it's about the same in the north and the south, even though the Southern Ocean is much bigger than the oceans in the Northern Hemisphere. The seasonal amplitude is about the same. So next plot, again, I'm going to show the column average amplitude and the surface amplitude. The column is again in blue and the surface is in red. There's a much bigger much more noticeable difference between the column and the surface for amplitude than there is for annual mean. And notice what I pointed out on the previous plot, that the seasonal amplitude and column mean is almost the same in both hemispheres. And again, this is showing to the same models I showed previously. So the seasonal cycle in APO for the column mean versus latitude. And I'll point out again that the two green curves, which are the same fluxes run through two atmospheric transport models, are almost identical. So we think we've solved the atmospheric transport problem, but the models diverge quite a bit. CCSM3 has very low seasonal amplitude in APO in the northern hemisphere. CESM1 is about right, but if you get to the southern hemisphere, it's actually overestimating the seasonal amplitude. So I'm looking forward to working with colleagues in CGD to try and understand those differences a little bit better and to also involve newer models in these comparisons. What's been done to date is a really detailed look at the Southern Ocean by Jonathan Bent, who I mentioned previously. So for his graduate work, he took the HIPPO measurements between 65 and 45 south, and for each of the 5 campaigns, did a detailed analysis of all of the uncertainties in terms of the spatial biases of where we flew, the temporal biases of what particular day we flew, and he's compared that to a similar suite of models. So the observations in the whiskers define the seasonal cycle in APO, and here he's showing the two database climatologies run through the different atmospheric transport models in blue, where I was showing them in green, but again, they agree very closely. The one model that jumps out here is this Nemo-Piscis-T model. It's notable because it was used to support some sort of high-profile speculation that the efficiency of the carbon sink in the Southern Ocean was decreasing. That was almost 8 years ago now, but that model has some clear problems in terms of the timing of its seasonal cycle. CESM is this green model here, which again in the Southern Ocean appears to be overestimating the observed gradient, but as I pointed out, it's doing pretty well in the Northern Hemisphere. So this was just another cartoon to highlight why we care about the Southern Ocean and also why it's sort of a complicated place. But what you have is both thermal and biological forcing that are impacting CO2 and oxygen differently. So as you bring deep water up and cool it off, you're taking up both oxygen and CO2. But as you have biological productivity going on, that's taking up CO2 and giving off oxygen. So the thermal effects are correlated and the biological effects are anti-correlated. And from that, we can hope to use the oxygen measurements to discern these two different influences. I'm not going to be talking about that more today, but just to highlight that as we warm the surface ocean, as climate changes, we expect to have sort of competing influences on CO2. So it's very hard for models to predict what's going to happen to the Southern Ocean CO2 sink in the future, because as you're warming, you're sort of reducing both the thermal uptake of CO2 and the biological outgassing of CO2 at high southern latitudes. I'm going backwards there. So to try and address this, okay, so we have this desire to know about the Southern Ocean. We have very sparse measurements in time, and we also have measurements that only go to about 60 south. So to address all of those things, we put an oxygen instrument on the NSF ship Laurence M. Gould in June of 2012, and it's been operating continuously since. It's shown here. It's a fuel cell technique. It's a little bit more robust than the ultraviolet technique on the airplane, but it's sort of slower to respond and not quite as precise. These are all the ship tracks over a period of about 10 years from that ship. It goes back and forth across Drake Passage, supporting the operations at Palmer Station, Antarctica. This is the time series, oxygen shown in green and CO2 shown in red, with flask measurements collected by the Scripps program at Palmer shown in the symbols. You notice that in the middle, the ship is out, in the open ocean, relative to the station. So the oxygen is higher in summer and lower in winter for the ship than it is for the station. In summer, you see these really high spikes in oxygen, which relate to biological productivity, and in the winter, you see these narrow troughs in oxygen, which relate to mixing events. And this is the same data plotted versus latitude for oxygen and CO2, where the month of the year is colored. So summer is green. So what you see in summer is high oxygen with sort of a bit of a bend to even higher values at the southernmost extent. The ship only does this kind of going really far south along the peninsula during summer. In winter, you see the opposite, actually big drawdowns in CO2 along the southern part of the peninsula. The scatter here in any individual sort of month or cruise is actually real atmospheric signal. It's not instrument noise. You can tell that because there's a cruise right here in June where the variability in the measurement is down around a few per meg and a few tenths of a ppm. So it's all information that we can use to get at fluxes. This looks like an instrument problem here, but that's actually real. The air was coming from east of South America across the Argentine basin where there was really high productivity, and then all of a sudden the front came through and the air switched to being from the west and the oxygen jumped way back down. So just a few more plots on this. This is the seasonal cycle in APO over the Southern Ocean from those data. And what we had before was this point, Palmer Station, and South Pole, which is out at 90 south, and Cape Grim, which is over here at 43 south. What we're finding from the ship is that the seasonal cycle in APO is much bigger than at these stations, and that there's this fairly narrow peak in amplitude. Comparing that to the same models, what you see is that they're sort of much more spread out than the observations in terms of this is the latitudinal peak in seasonal amplitude. That's sort of expected because the ocean models themselves are fairly coarse. These are sort of models that are running at several degree resolution, except, well, actually CESM and MOM are, I believe, 1 degree. But the atmospheric transport models that we then convolved these fluxes with are also very coarse, something like 4 degree resolution. So the models are diffuse. There is, because we're doing surface measurements, this uncertainty to transport. The two same fluxes but different atmospheric transport models are differing by about 10%. And then CESM, again, is overestimating the seasonal amplitude at these latitudes. All the models, except for CESM, seem to be doing a pretty good job south of the polar front. For some reason, north of about 58 south, they're overestimating the seasonal cycles quite a bit. So again, there's a lot of work to be done here to sort of understand causes of these differences with the models. So I'll just wrap up by saying what the next steps are. The plan is to exercise sort of the models we have output for, but some others by comparison to the HIPPO and the Gould data sets, and to really kind of move beyond saying the models are overestimated and underestimated, and try and understand what processes in the model might be causing the differences with the observations. I mentioned very briefly that I'm investigating using relationships between CO2 and oxygen to get at the various thermal and biological forcing of the fluxes. And then a big one is there's a big potential there to merge in existing data sets. So this map is showing sort of historic and ongoing oxygen measurements. In this talk, I primarily showed measurements from the Scripps network, which is the red circles. Princeton ran a network for many years, which is now discontinued, which is the black circles, and they were also doing these shipboard measurements. This was a station I ran that's discontinued. Here's the Gould shown on here. But there are a couple European groups which are doing a lot of measurements, and then a Japanese group which is doing a bunch of flash samples from ships crossing the Pacific. The challenge is not everyone's on the same calibration scale. So there's an ongoing program of mailing cylinders around the world and doing measurements on them to try and establish a basis for merging people's measurements on different calibration scales. And there's also the possibility that different sampling procedures at different sites can lead to biases. So you can't just lump all the data together the way you'd like to. And finally, new observations. So I'll just highlight a few of these. Orcas, as Stuart mentioned, is going to be a campaign on the Gulfstream V next January and February out of Punta Arenas, Chile. Matt Long from CGD is my co-PI, and we have a huge team of collaborators. We don't have a logo yet, so that's an ongoing project. We're also funded, and Andy Watt is rapidly building an oxygen system to go on the new flagship CSIRO vessel, the Investigator. It's more or less a copy of the instrument that's on the Gould, and that ship will operate out of Hobart, spending a lot of time over the Southern Ocean, but then also going up to the tropics. There's a NASA-funded project, which is, people have variously called different perturbations of the name HIPPO, but it's called ATOM, and it's on the DC-8, and this is the flight track it's going to do in 4 different campaigns over 3 years. And we're in discussions to write a proposal to join this mission, but we're not currently funded to do so. In conclusion, we now have a very extensive set of observations of the latitudinal and vertical extent of oxygen over the Pacific Basin. The Pacific bulge appears to be about 1/2 to 1/3 of what some of the early modeling estimates suggested it might be, and it seems to be shifted south of the ITCZ. The gradient is about -8 per meg lower in the north, and suggesting that a range of ocean models, both those that I showed from Laura Resplandi's work and as well the ones that I've collected, are underestimating the northward transport of heat and the southward transport of carbon, and that may be related to, again, penetration of heat at low latitudes. The APO seasonal cycle over the Southern Ocean is bigger than we thought it was previously, just based on station measurements, and the latitudinal peak in amplitude is sharper than models would suggest. And again, there's great potential for testing and improving models in comparison to these data sets. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Britt. Do we have any questions? I'm sure we do.
Britt, it seems like kind of a leap of faith, unless I'm missing something, that because 2 atmospheric models agree, therefore they're correct.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to say that, but it's worth clarifying that I think that, well, because those agree, there's a suggestion that uncertainty in atmospheric transport is not having a big effect on these column averages that we're calculating. Ideally, we would run, as has been done in some large community projects, 10 to 15 different atmospheric transport models and really get a sense for the spread. But for that very reason you mentioned, which is when you do that, you don't know which of those is right. My approach is to try and derive metrics from the data that are insensitive to that uncertainty. So in particular, I'm doing this for CO2 as well from HIPPO and other aircraft campaigns, but if you take an aircraft and you fly from the surface through the boundary layer up into the mid-troposphere and calculate an integral, it's largely insensitive to how deep that boundary layer was on a given day. It's a good question. Yes, Cindy. If you use the microphone, then the people, if there are people online, they can hear you.
It'll be going
Or I
to the
can repeat
recording.
the question, yeah.
Yeah, those 2 ATMs you use, do they disagree at the surface but agree in the column average?
Yes, they do, and I'm trying to remember if I had a plot showing that. I apologize that I think I don't have that in this set of slides, but they do disagree quite markedly for Palmer and Cape Grim stations. So Jonathan Bent looked at that in his dissertation, and so I've forgotten the exact number, but it's on the order of a sort of a 40% difference in the seasonal amplitude they would predict at one of those stations in the Southern Ocean.
I think I missed something. So when you show the 90s, their black and white picture, their observation shows a very strong latitude difference, variation, and the model shows the big bulge. But then after you observed it for many years, 3 years or whatever, composite picture, so the observation, the HIPPO observation agree with the model. So what about the early observations that indicated the Southern Ocean has a large variation, or there's column versus the surface? I think I missed.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it's very good that you caught that. I completely glossed over one issue, which is interannual variability, that has been shown to play a big role in the gradient. So I think I skipped a plot, which may come up here. This is a paper by Roberta Hom showing, this is now south-north, it's a Hofmüller diagram going from the early 90s to the present. And it's just a linear interpolation of a few stations shown by these black lines. And you can see there's quite a bit of interannual variability in the station measurement. So we think that's related to interannual variability in fluxes. This particular blue blob here has been linked to deep mixing in the North Pacific. So a couple of years in a row without big storms in the North Pacific, and then one year we get big storms and you've got all this water with depleted oxygen in it. But it could also be related to things going on with atmospheric transport influencing the boundary layer differently in different years. So with the HIPPO, unfortunately, we don't have a good handle on the interannual variability. There was something else that happened after. So I wrote my paper in 1998, and subsequently there was a discovery that the way that flasks are sampled at South Pole is they could only get them out once a year. And so they sat around for 6 months at really cold temperatures. And there was a little bit of nitrogen leaking out, permeating through the O-rings during that time. So the measurements, the South Pole measurements that went into that paper are now sort of recommended not to be used for this type of thing because they were biased. They were biased a little bit high. So they switched in '99 to a procedure of keeping the flasks in a heated building instead of a garage outside. So so part of what you saw in that early plot for this for the high southern latitudes turned out to be an instrument bias. Part of it is interannual variability in either ocean transport or atmospheric transport.
Any further questions?
If I recall correctly, didn't you start all this looking at asking questions about the estimates for CO2 exchange with the ocean? And I wonder what implications this has broadly for CO2 uptake by the ocean.
Yeah, so that, going way back to sort of the 80s when Dave Killian was writing some of the first papers looking at global CO2, he surmised this sort of 1.5 billion tons of carbon southward transport of CO2 in the oceans. Now most of the estimates are done using that are done using atmospheric models are getting a much smaller sort of north-south transport of CO2 in the oceans. And the way that these systems estimate fluxes, they usually assume a much smaller error on the ocean component. So, for example, the NOAA carbon tracker system, it has several different estimates of ocean CO2 flux that it plugs in, but the model has much more leeway to vary fluxes over land because they're larger and the uncertainties are larger than it does over the ocean. So the what you put in as the prior guess of the ocean fluxes ends up having a big impact on what you get out. So the project that Laura Resplandy and Ralph Keeling are working on is to try and come up with a better prior estimate. And the problem is they're at a point now where they've identified that this set of ocean models they have all underestimate the northward transport of heat and southward transport of CO2, but they don't have a model that they think does a good job. Laura's working with Matt Long and CGD to possibly use CESM, which seems to do a much better job, at least at SSTs than some other, the north-south SST gradients than some other models. It's not quite the same thing as heat transport. But the method she uses involves running these sort of dye tracers forwards and then inverting them. So there's some mechanics that have to be done. But there's a hope to find a model that does a better job that would then give a better answer. The big picture is that if you're underestimating the uptake of CO2 in the north by the ocean, then you're inferring it on land. And that potentially feeds into sort of this missing land sink in the north that we have a hard time finding because it may be that some of it's actually in the ocean.
Okay, I have one question for you, Britt, an instrument question. These mobile instruments like the vacuum UV oxygen analyzer, you're looking for small differences in large values of oxygen. So you're carrying along a reference cylinder everywhere you go for these reference on slide?
Yeah, that's not depicted in this picture, but we use fiber wrapped aluminum cylinders on the plane, which are, I think which are the kind of thing that a fireman carries into a burning building. So they're small and light, and there are 4 of them in this box in the bottom of the AO2 instrument. And it's a challenge to, again, get air into there, then measure it in lab, and then assume it's going to have the same concentration throughout the campaign, and also assume that the air you pull out of it will have the same composition as the average of the cylinder. But one of those gases is running all the time, and the instrument's switching every 2 seconds and calibrating it. And then the others are used to sort of span the instrument.
Any further questions? If not, let's thank again Britt.
Thank you.